Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. This week, we turn our focus with the French to the major and extremely bloody battles fought in late 1914 and the first half of 1915 on the Western Front, with a focus on prominent high ground, including the notorious Vimy Ridge. Well, hello, Dan. Hello, James. Pleasure to be joining you again as we continue our gallop through an overview of the French army, the French nation, and its battles on the Western Front, because, of course, it is in many ways a French war with allies joining, the Belgians, the British, the Americans, even the Italians at the latter stage of the war. And so this focus on the French, I think, especially for our English listeners, I hope is really useful to remind us that the French army is going through an intense period of warfare through 15, 16, really the entire First World War. And when we left the story last week, the Battle of the Marne had been won, the Schlieffen Plan had been defeated, the Germans had been driven back, although not routed. And the situation I think we find at the latter stage of 1914 is a contrast, James, because on one hand, the armies, as you laid out last week, are exhausted. British, French, German, all exhausted and heavy losses for all fighting arms. And yet at the same time, there's still opportunity here for that rarest of things on the Western Front, and that's maneuver warfare. And perhaps you could just explain where the commander's eyes are drawn in the aftermath of the Battle of the Marne.
Absolutely. As the Germans are beginning their retreat, as you mentioned at the end of last week's episode, the Foreign Minister Bateman Hovig issues his demands of September. The French demand of September is go away. And that's something that the French army is going to try to make happen. As the Germans are withdrawing, they're going to fall back from ridgeline to ridgeline. They're looking for that prime defensive ground. And the French are going to be trying to outflank them, get around them, try to get to that next ridgeline, try to continue on the offensive and get the Germans out of occupied France. Again, a sizable proportion of France is under occupation, let alone the majority of Belgium. But it's the industrial heartland of France. It is where most French industry is concentrated, and it's the sacred soil of the fatherland. So the French soldier is going to be highly motivated. The French army is going to be highly maneuverable in this attempt to get around the Germans as they're establishing defensive positions. And that's going to lead us into what is known as the race to the sea. Very well understood by your listeners, as I'm sure. But in summary, this battle that will extend what becomes the Western Front all the way from the Swiss border to the North Sea. And for the French army, this is about stabilization in the line in Alsace and Lorraine, and then trying to outpace the Germans as the lines extend from those battlefields of the First Battle of the Marne to the North Sea. And the first major engagement they're going to go into is the First Battle of the Aisne. There's going to be multiple battles of the Aisne throughout the war. And you're already starting to see some interesting old tactics being used, as well as some new tactics. One of the ones that is very reminiscent of the old comes to us from the 18th Infantry Regiment, who's fighting in a town called Villers-Bois, just below the Chemin des Dames, which is it's a road that runs just to the north of the Aisne River and will be a focus of fighting throughout the war. The 18th attacks a regiment of Saxons who barricade themselves in houses in Le Villers-Bois, literally the village in the woods. And the regimental history remembers that the enemy barricaded themselves in the houses, firing from windows, doors, roofs at everyone who was approaching. And somewhat medievally, the members of the 18th set fire to these houses with oil and straw. And as the Germans start running out, they either take them prisoners or kill or wound them. Eventually, German strongpoints, these aren't full dugouts yet, these are still occupied farmhouses, have to be destroyed, as they call it, combat engineers with petards. And they say the neighboring house of the one burned down by Captain Melin, who's one of these company commanders, collapsed to the use of petards, and all the Germans who were occupied in it were buried under the rubble. At that moment, the defender of two homes, the Saxons, warned that they would suffer the same fate, would surrender. So you have these old tactics and combine that with the experience of Colonel Emile Alejo, who is in command of the 20th Infantry Regiment, also fighting in Champagne near the end, part of this greater battle, remembers that our infantry had made a rush forward. Part of the Bavarian line fell back. Another gust of shrapnel from our 75 millimeter guns, this time a bit longer in range than the first. Another almost simultaneous rush by our infantrymen, sticking to their artillery's projectiles, advanced with wonderful eagerness and reached the Bavarian infantry at almost the same time as our shells. It continued like that, with rushes following gusts until at least the Bavarians flowed back in disorder. And reading that second account from the colonel of the 20th Infantry Regiment, does that tactic sound at all familiar to you guys as we think about later battles in the war? I don't know, Dr. Jones, anything that pops to mind for you?
It absolutely sounds like it. And it goes back to something I mentioned last week. There's searching really for older ideas of fire and movement. And how do you do it on a massive battlefield? It's not enough to deliver a bombardment and then attack. You need to try and combine these two. It's difficult. And ultimately, the answer is going to lie in creeping barrages that move with the infantry. And this sounds very, very like this. And glad you mentioned about the difficulty of actually clearing out buildings and so forth during this movement, because this is something that becomes an increasing problem, a brief problem in some ways, because trench warfare will end it, but an increasing problem that the fighting we're going to see in and around Flanders as the armies begin to move north is a little different to the fighting that's been on the Marne, where generally there's a lot of woods, but generally the terrain is quite rolling, it's quite open. As you head further north, you start to get more and more buildings, get more and more villages, quite densely packed. And I know from my own experience that the British Army has a lot of trouble in street fighting in 1914. Street fighting in villages, the British don't really have a standard grenade. There is a grenade, but it's only used by the Royal Engineers, pretty rare piece of kit. British artillery doesn't have a high explosive shell apart from its howitzers, so you can't bring those down. And I've read, just you mentioned about medieval tactics, accounts of British soldiers improvising battering rams to break down the doors of farmhouses to clear them of German defenders, and vice versa as well. The Germans using these methods. So this is very, very bitter and confused and intense fighting, combined with the development of techniques that we're going to see to define the First World War. But this movement, it's a war of movement as well, which I think is really worth emphasizing. And Dan, the armies are starting to move into an area now, which certainly many British battlefield studies would recognize, because they're leaving the Marne area and they're starting to move up into the Flanders plain.
Absolutely. If you pick really just a handful of battles and you were to plot them on a map, you can just draw a series of little X's and you can move closer and closer till eventually you reach the English Channel. So as James well described, First Battle of the Aisne obviously is going to run really through the bulk of September. But from then onwards, you've got the Battle of Albert. Albert, of course, one of the famous hub towns on the Somme. So right in the heart of the Somme battlefield. That's going to be followed just a couple of days later by the First Battle of Arras, which is a few miles further up the road. That then is going to lead on eventually to the First Battle of Ypres, which is, of course, in Belgium and is famed for British involvement. Just to point this out as well, actually, if those of you guys who are listening to this thinking, well, hang on a minute, the last time we saw the BEF was way down on the Aisne outside Paris. They've actually been taken out of the line by this point, and they've been shuffled back up to the northern, what is now becoming the northern flank of the Allied line of the Western Front. The reason being, of course, is that their communication supplies and everything are coming from the UK, which are much closer, and so they're easier to sustain in that particular location. So they're thrown back into the line with French either side as the First Battle of Ypres is going to go on, including famous actions like the actions in and around Gellivelt that we've covered previously on this podcast. And then eventually to the north of that, we're going to go right up towards Dixmude, which is really the last of the major combats before you actually reach the sea. The end of the Western Front is going to be at a place called Newport. Dixmude, famed if you ever go out to the battlefields, known for the Trench of Death, which doesn't sound like a particularly healthy place to be, and for good reason, it's not a very healthy one. That's actually going to turn out to be one of the most static parts of the entire Western Front, largely because of an action in 1914 that sees a series of sluice gates open that flood that entire part of the plain. That's going to become part of the Belgian army's 6 or 7 miles. But it's an extremely interesting time period because typically we talk about trench warfare starting in October of 1914. And whilst there's truth in that, it does start, but it also doesn't at the same time. It starts and then it ripples northwards. So Dixmude really doesn't have trenches until we get well into November. The N has trenches, you could argue, by the end of September. So you can almost picture, if you were to paint this, it's a series of little arrows moving northwards till eventually they join up at the sea. And then, of course, finally, we've got the famed Western Front. But that, James, is going to bring us a whole series of new problems because, one, we're getting to the end of the first real campaigning season in 1914. People are still trying to find their feet in trench warfare. Trenches are, of course, incredibly crude, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that the fighting is completely tailed off for the year. There are still going to be significant actions, and the learning curve really starts in a huge way about this same time.
The fighting of 1914 is going to see a revolution in military theory, revolution in military thought. And as both of you have mentioned, these battles following the First Battle of the Marne, leading to the end of the year, see continued understanding, as we listened and discussed about in the last episode. The French army is learning on the fly, sort of revisiting what they thought they knew and getting new ideas and changing day by day and unit by unit. There is information sharing among units. Corps headquarters are sending messages to one another saying, hey, this happened to us today. Check this out and maybe try it differently than we did. And there are several examples if you go to the French Army archives at Vincennes that you can explore. And these battles are going to be battles that the British and the Dominion forces are going to see firsthand, as you see accounts say of the Battle of Arras in 1917. There's constant accounts of British soldiers saying, oh, we were digging a trench and we came across a French graveyard. That's from these battles in 1914. Devastating battles of which I don't think justice has been done in terms of the history of the Great War. One that I'll rewind a bit and say that I'm particularly motivated about and selfishly bring up is what I think is the most interesting battle, personally think is the most interesting battle of the First World War, which is the First Battle of Ypres. And for the French, they quantify it as the First Battle of Flanders. And you'll see occasional references to Ypres. You'll see references to overarchingly the Battle of the Yser, which is a river connecting Ypres to the North Sea. But this battle in most histories has gone down as a British and German engagement. And there are a lot of French soldiers there. 85,000 French soldiers will become casualties during the First Battle of Ypres, as compared to 58,000 British, 20,000 Belgian, and 130,000 Germans. But the battle lasts a bit longer for the French forces. Just like the BEF, the French forces that are going to be fighting in Flanders have also been transported up there. It's not the same units that have slowly but surely been working their way north. The forces that are going to be in this area have been transported from Alsace, from Lorraine, from the other end of the French line, continuing on with Joffre's ability to place units. They've been placed under an army group under the command of Ferdinand Foch, with several other commanders we'll meet later on, like Durbal and others. And they are going to be among the first Allied forces there to support the Belgian army that is falling back. You'll have a group of what are called in the French Navy, the Fusiliers Marins. These are naval riflemen, not Marines. Marines are part of the French army, literally sailors with rifles, defending these canals over the Yser before backed up by French territorials against these older men. A division of territorials from Brittany will be serving in this area. And then as the battle shifts towards the area of Ypres itself, these areas that your listeners will know very well, Gouavelt, Zonnebec, the French army and their regular active infantry forces will show up, primarily the 9th Army Corps. And on the 1st of November, they're going to be thrown into the line. And that northern half of what becomes the Ypres salient is going to be held by these French forces. And it's a confusing battle. To return to this idea of this a mobile sort of warfare that's developing, what we call trench warfare, there is not a lot of understanding of what is exactly going on. As we're in this hybrid era of there's got to be movement from one trench to another, but static warfare hasn't fully developed yet. The 114th Infantry Regiment remembered fighting between Zonnebec and Passchendaele that the situation is not very clear. Where exactly is the enemy? Where are we ourselves? And how are our liaisons established? so many problems whose solution is far from easy. All one can feel is that a dam has been feverishly broken in places, that one is getting through. One must bind the cracks if one does not want to be properly submerged. And this goes both ways. Not only are the Germans assaulting, trying to break across the Serre Canal, trying to break into the town of Ypres, but the French are also attacking, trying to push the Germans back, and at many points embedded among the British forces. And it's an absolutely horrific battle. And Spence, I don't know if you want to comment on just the tenacity of the fighting in late October and early November around Ypres.
Absolutely. And we've not actually covered First Ypres in its own dedicated episode. I'm sure we will, because First Ypres, I think you've painted a great picture of just the confusion, the violence of this battle. Even given what we discussed last week, the intense violence of the Battle of the Marne and the Battle of the Frontiers. First Ypres, for soldiers who've gone through the frontiers, who've gone through the Marne, there's a very common theme. British, French, Belgian, German sources say this fighting around Ypres is just appalling. Ranges are very, very close. The movement of the lines, it becomes quite limited, certainly by mid to late October. You're fighting over devastated villages like Gilleveld, like others, fighting in blasted out woods. It is this hybrid period where trenches are very, very crude. You don't really have continuous entrenchment. The fighting is intense. The casualties are enormous. And I'm glad you've emphasized the cost to the French army here, because First Ypres, especially in the 20s and 30s, occupies a very special place in the British memory. It's proportionately the bloodiest battle the British army fights on the entire Western Front. And that's partially because the army is small and it suffers proportionally very, very heavy casualties, but it breaks the old pre-war army. British army's never the same again. It's the first time that the Indian army is going to be involved for the British as well, and they fight very hard at Ypres. And one thing that comes across is confusion, chaos, destruction. And to just emphasize this, a commander I studied quite a lot, a man called Bulgy Thorne, the nickname's Bulgy. Andrew Thorne is his name. He's a staff officer in 1st Guards Brigade at First Ypres. He'll go on to have a pretty stellar career in the First and Second World War. And listeners, his letters are all preserved in the Imperial War Museum, and he's very much an up and at them kind of man. He's stiff upper lip, the epitome of an Edwardian fighting soldier. And he admits to his wife in those letters he had nightmares about First Ypres because the battle was so intense. The carnage was so great. The margins were so fine. First Ypres, a bit like the Marne, doesn't have much of a historiographical footprint in the way that, say, Third Ypres does. So interesting one to revisit and discuss. And you mentioned, too, 130,000 German casualties, because the huge losses, somewhere in the region of 293 casualties in total for the fighting armies, 130,000 German casualties, because the Germans are throwing everything to try and break through here. And ultimately, they fail. They fail, the lines solidify, and the Western Front, as we know it, as we've discussed it, as we've named our podcast after, is born. And one thing worth reflecting on, I'll go to you for this, Dan, is what's the situation like at the end of 1940 for the strategists, for the commanders who are looking at this? James made clear the French army is going to try and evict the Germans. British army's recovering, the German army's recovering too. What's the vision for 1915? What's the strategy here?
It's a really interesting one, and I think we can boil it down. If we go back to the absolute kind of bare bones simplicity here, almost schoolyard style, you can say really by 1914, the German army has tried to beat up and knock out either Britain or France, or ideally both. It's failed to achieve both, and so it's now going to take a defensive posture. Really, by the time we get to December, the German army is an offensive force, but that year is spent. And of course, it now needs to contend with the fact that the sleeping giant that is the Russians, albeit a pretty badly knocked about Russians following battles like Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes, they are going to be a serious contender in the following years. So the Germans now need to rebalance to a certain extent. They're going to take their foot off the gas on the west. They're going to take up defensive positions. They're going to start looking for terrain features. They're going to start digging in, creating defense in depth. And they're not really going to be looking at a major offensive in anywhere on the Western Front for the year. That's going to change slightly. There will be the Second Battle of Ypres, but that's really a cover for what's going on further to the east. Their attention is predominantly going to be turned eastwards, at the same time as the Brits and the French, who are, if you like, metaphorically rather politely asked the Germans if they wouldn't mind leaving the 90% of Belgium, big France that they've captured. The answer is, of course, no. The British and French grand strategic vision is going to be to make them leave. And that's really what we're going to see in early 1915 is concerted French, British and British Empire efforts to force the Germans to relinquish the ground that they've captured in the early part of the war. Little by little, that is going to start to have an effect, but it's going to be incredibly bloody. There are going to be lots of failures along the way. 1915 is not known as a particularly good year for the Allies in any stretch of the imagination, but it doesn't mean it's an inactive year, particularly in the northern part of the line. And we should make the distinction here as well. Really, by the end of 1914, a good chunk of the line that we traditionally think of, certainly from a British perspective, as being British areas. We're talking about Arras, we're talking about the area around Bethune, we're talking about the Somme, Saint-Quentin, all of these kind of areas that we know the Brits are going to occupy later in the war. They're still French at this point, and they're going to remain French for a significant period of time. In fact, the northern part of the Ypres salient is going to be occupied by the French during this period of time as well. The British are really wedged in a very small area, and the French are going to be doing most of the fighting and most of the dying in the early part of 1915. By the time we settle down to, as we very well know from previous episodes, a cold, grim Christmas period, it's still going to be, there's going to be the last few shades of the race to the sea and the Battle of Flanders are going to play out in various little pockets up in the northern part of the line. Actually, what we're going to look at is really concerted French efforts in the first half of the next year to force the Germans out. Bear in mind, this is an invading country occupying staggering amounts of French territory and Belgian territory. Both of the major belligerents in terms of the French and Belgium, both of them desperately do not want the Germans on their territory, and they're going to do everything they can to eject them. Unfortunately, it's going to take a very long time, and it's going to be incredibly bloody in lives.
This fighting is not going to stop for the French army, even through Christmas. This brings us to Christmas 1914, and we have to, of course, as always, I listened to the last two myths of the First World War, guys, talk about the Christmas truce and what's happening. Of course, as you guys have discussed, it very, very small scale. It does happen in some places on the Western Front, but for the majority of the French army, they're engaged in offensive actions. From the 15th of December to the 5th of January is the first Battle of Artois. This is the fighting around Vimy Ridge, and we'll be discovering place names that will be known to British and Canadian listeners, such as Souchez, Carency, as well as places that might not be as familiar, but both geographically as well as historiographically loom over these battlefields, such as Notre Dame de Lorette, which will be battles that we will go into more detail on. But the French soldiers have varying reactions to Christmas 1914. Captain Ferdinand Belmont, who is an officer, he's a very religious man who is serving in the 11th Battalion of Chasseurs Alpins, these elite French mountain troops, now finding themselves on the plains of Picardy. Can't imagine being a highly trained mountain soldier and you spent the end of the year in Flanders below sea level. And he remembered just to hear how wretched the music of war was on Christmas night. Certainly on that night of many prayers, much suffering, lives perhaps were offered for the redemption and salvation of the country, and all of that cannot be in vain. He also mentioned in this same letter, which was published in the war, unfortunately, Captain Belmont doesn't survive the war, and his letters to his family were published during the war, both in French and English, under the title A Crusader of France. He remembered something that, again, gets at the heart of who the French soldier is. It's a mass conscript army with people coming from all over society. And he remembered attending midnight mass on Christmas of 1914. It was just a few kilometers from the German lines where the touching melodies of the Christmas carols. The church is not large, and many chasseurs had to remain at the door. A soldier whose red trousers appeared under his cassock said mass. So even priests are being conscripted and serving in infantry units during this time. During this last offensive, you're going to see the last major casualties for the French army in 1914. By the end of the year, there's going to be 301,000 dead. And this is not the bloodiest year for the French army in the Great War. This averages out to about 2,220 killed per day from the declaration of war to the end of the year of 1914. So, an incredibly horrible experience for the French army. There are obviously some successes tactically. There is a better understanding of how operating in maneuver warfare is going to carry out. But at the end of the day, these losses are unsustainable. And there is a direct thought that how are we going to avenge these men? And it's going to carry us into 1915 with mass offensives all across the Western Front that begin almost as soon as the year starts.
Yeah, and what's really interesting, I think, that ties all of these together is that actually almost all of them are going to be fought in and around high ground. Now, when we take it in context and obviously knowing the understanding of the story, it's no great surprise because, of course, now we're starting to see, Spence, the emergence of artillery really as the dominant force. And I think you could argue as early as 1915 that does become the case. All of a sudden, high ground, ergo observation, is going to be absolutely vital. Those that dominate the high grounds hold the ace cards in terms of being able to use their artillery to most effect. And really by early 1915, would it be fair to say that it's already become clear that without dominant artillery, you're just not going to make a sustainable and achievable breakthrough?
It has. And we discussed last week about French improvements in artillery tactics. They've been mirrored by the British and indeed the Germans. All sides are reaching for superior artillery methods, incorporating aerial reconnaissance, heavier guns are being called for, more ammunition. All the armies are basically short of ammunition by the end of 1914. They need to rebuild their stocks. And once the Western Front's formed and you've got trench lines, you're beginning to get barbed wire en masse, we've discussed previously, the only way to break this in 1915 is through very heavy artillery fire. Infantry cannot succeed in 1915 unless that wire is breached. And the only method to do it on a large scale is artillery. And if you can combine that with destroying the German trenches and their machine gun nests and so forth, that's seen as the recipe for success. But in 1915, I think the balance between attacker and defenders we've discussed previously is favoring the Germans. High ground's crucial. Perhaps we should have talked a little bit more about as the Western Front forms. The Germans have an advantage that the Allies don't. The Allies cannot give up a yard of ground. It's politically dynamite. You can't be seen to surrendering French or Belgian territory, but a fight for every last yard. The Germans can surrender some of this territory in return for getting a tactical advantage. So what we see across the Western Front as it solidifies in 1914 and 15 is Germans making small withdrawals, not very far, but so they can occupy high ground. They can occupy better defensive positions. Whereas the British and the French and the Belgians don't feel they have that. They need to press on. And in fact, in 15, there's going to be controversy in the British Army about requests to give up ground to go to better positions because it's not politically acceptable. So the Germans have occupied this very strong position. And as we've laid out, they occupy the observation points. Aerial observation is developing in 15, but if you've got on the ground forward artillery observers, that's better than aerial observation, really, for the entire First World War. Perhaps changing by 18, but certainly in 15, you want a team with binoculars and a telephone on high ground. That's going to give you responsive, accurate, directed artillery fire. And the Germans have all this high ground. And so if the French want to achieve their ambition, which I think is twofold in a way in 1915, obviously drive the Germans out, liberate France, keep Russia in the war as well, because Germans have been stymied in the West. They've turned their main offensive against the Russians. And really from May 1915, the Russians will be under huge pressure from the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. Very important to the Allies to keep the Russians fighting. How can you do that? Well, you can launch offensives in the West. Try and draw German forces there instead. So all these pressures are on the French. A natural desire to avenge the losses of 14, reclaim the lost territories, and a strategic imperative to keep the Germans from just transferring everything east. And it's going to contribute to some intensely bitter fighting in 1915. But before we get on to that, James, I wonder if you could sketch us a little picture about how the French army is adapting and changing in 15. Because Great quote about the mass being read by a soldier in red trousers. But by 1915, a polyou of spring 1915 looked rather different to a polyou of August 1914.
Absolutely. So, in terms of material culture, which is fascinating, we get into deep fashion history because there's going to be some famous designers who are going to become involved in the creation of new uniforms for the French army. By October of 1914, the French are issuing out mechanics trousers, what they call toile pantalon. So, these are civilian mechanical trousers, generally dark blue, that they wear over their red pants. But then you start to see a light blue, a bleu clair, and then in 1915, what we now know as Bleu Horizon or Horizon Blue is beginning to be issued out. And the idea behind Horizon Blue, of course, is that the French are going to be attacking primarily in the day, and a German soldier looking up might see the soldier not necessarily against the back of the sky, but the uniforms are going to be changing. Weapons are going to be changing. By the middle of the year, you're going to see introductions of light machine guns, the Shosho, which is my favorite weapon of the First World War. I should add, I am a hardcore defender of the Shosho, especially among my fellow American historians of the Great War. So they're going to be developing tactically. They're going to be developing in terms of the uniforms they're wearing, and slowly but surely learning as they go. But it's trial and error through the year. Two terms, and listeners, if you don't speak any French, you're going to leave this episode knowing poor pronunciation of at least two French words. And these are the two words that Joffre uses during the year to explain the French army's grand strategy on the Western Front. The first is percée, which is breakthrough. The French are trying throughout the year to achieve this breakthrough, something all armies on the Western Front dream of through the war. However, there is an understanding that this isn't just going to happen. There's not going to be one large assault, and all of a sudden the German army is going to disperse, and French soldiers are going to march triumphantly from Amiens to Berlin. So the French strategy that Joffre decides to go forward with is this idea of nibbling away. And the French word and the term used at the time is clignotage, literally to nibble away. And that is going to be the French army strategy in 1915. Now, there's only a few spots on the Western Front that are suitable for this. Obviously, we've talked about these Battle of the Observatories, these high ground, these hills, Les Eparges, which is just to the east of Verdun, brutal battle overlooking the Woevre Plain. This is where, for those who might know anything about literature history of the Great War, Maurice Genevoix, the famous artist, is serving and is wounded early in 1915. But battlefields that are actually prepared, battlefields where the French can see the possibility of a breakthrough, of a clignotage, are going to be centered around Champagne and around Artois as well. So this is going to see a numerous battles. There's going to be 2 battles in Champagne in 1915. There's going to be 3 battles in Artois over the same fields, villages, and hamlets. There's going to be offensives in the spring in the Vosges. There's going to be offensives in the Argonne, in the Meuse, in the Woevre, again in the Argonne in May and July, again in the Woevre in June and July, in the Vosges again in July and December. And additionally, there's going to be French participation in non-European engagements. So the French army will be sending detachments into Serbia. They'll be sending detachments into the Dardanelles, as well as the French Navy will be present during the Gallipoli campaign, and French forces fighting in Africa, both in sub-Saharan Africa against potential tribes that they're scared are allied with the Germans, and in Morocco, especially as well. A lot of French territorials who see combat in the First World War actually see combat in Morocco, interestingly enough. So a very, very convoluted global look, but a very, very precise look at nibbling away to achieve this breakthrough in 2 or 3 sectors of the Western Front. And globally, how does that French aspect fit into what the Allies are trying to do, Dan?
When we're talking about trying to stretch resources generally, we know, famously, we've not actually covered it yet, but we will go on to cover the Dardanelles. I think it's going to be our very next mini-series, actually, following this one. We're going to be looking in detail exactly what was intended with the Dardanelles to knock out, of course, the Ottomans and therefore increase further support towards the Russians and stretch the Central Powers even further. That's going to be a notable failure. In fact, interestingly, just about the Dardanelles, very briefly, the French are actually going to suffer more casualties than Australians do in that particular fight, which is totally overlooked. And I know we've got a lot of Australian listeners, so to give you some perspective of just how big the French involvement is, even in areas where they play a relatively small role, the French assaults at Kerivsdale are going to be absolutely brutal, and they end up suffering staggering casualties in that campaign. But I just want to bring us back for a second to a battle that I find particularly interesting, and really in the northern part of the Western Front, it's the most significant for the first part of 1915. It's going to be the Second Battle of Artois. And we should mention a lot of these battles that are fought have the distant objective of ideally putting pressure on and capturing Lille. Lille is a big problem for the French. It's about the third or fourth biggest city in the country at the time. It's also their industrial powerhouse. It's where their coal supplies are taken to. It's a massive hub for industrial power. It's been taken by the Germans early in the war, and the French are not happy at all about it. Germans are delighted. In fact, the Germans are going to fight tooth and nail to defend it, including creating what they call the Lille Defense Ring, about 1,000 concreted bunkers that are going to be very effective from 1915 onwards. But the Second Battle of Artois, even the British involvement at Neuchâtel and Vimy Ridge, Festubert, they're all going to have the distant objective of capturing Lille. And for those who've been with Spence and I so far, as we've talked about things like the 1915 British battles, Loos, Artois, Neuchâtel, almost exclusively, there is a companion French attack at the same time, about 5 or 10 miles down the road, to act as the southern part of that pincer that eventually is going to hopefully liberate Lille. Most of that is going to happen across two key locations. One of them we know very famously is the 1917 battlefield known as Vimy Ridge, and the other is going to be an area known as the Lorette Spur. Now, the Lorette Spur today is home to perhaps the most remarkable of all sites, certainly on the northern part of the Western Front, in terms of the French story of the Great War. There's a national necropolis, one of two in France. One is at Fort Douaumont at Verdun. The second is the national necropolis of Notre-Dame de Lorette, Our Lady of Lorette, on the Lorette Spur. Something like 44,000 French burials up there, beautifully commemorated today. There's also something called the Ring of Remembrance, which overlooks this high ground. Effectively, the Second Battle of Artois is going to see incredibly brutal fighting fought in between Lorette. If you consider it this way, Lorette and Vimy are a bit like two fingers on a glove, kind of sticking out into no man's land. Whoever occupies them occupies that vital high ground and can overlook a position known as the Douai Plain, which is that flat coal mining plain in front of Lille. This is a really key and crucial location, and the French are going to lose staggering numbers, not only of French soldiers, but also of those from North Africa. So massive, massive losses. I always point out, I'm just going to sidetrack to one particular story because I always point out one when I go up to Notre Dame de Lorette today. And if you go just inside the beautiful church, which commemorates all of those that's killed, there's a little plaque to one particular man, and his name is Francois Faber. He is very well known, actually, at the years before the war. He's a national celebrity. He's one of the sort of David Beckhams of his era at that time. He's born in 1887 in Luxembourg. He is the first foreigner to win the Tour de France. He's known as the Giant of Colombes. And in 1909, he famously wins the Tour de France, becoming the first non-Frenchman ever to do it. He does it in a really staggering way for any cycling geeks out there. Wins 5 stages in a row. Still hasn't been done, even today, 100 plus years later. Nobody else has achieved the same thing, including having to run 1 kilometer with his bike over his shoulder for the final stage after his chain snapped, and still won the Tour de France. So this is an incredible guy. He would have won it as well in 1910, except he ran over a dog, which caused him to fall off and end up quite severely injured and didn't finish the race. But he goes on, and like the 1912 and 1913 winner, is going to lose his life in the First World War. So being a Tour de France rider in the pre-war years, quite a dangerous occupation. Francois Faber actually joins the French Foreign Legion, and he is on the Lorette Spur on the 9th of May in the heat of the Second Battle of Artois. He's going to be killed. Incidentally, he's just received that very morning a telegram from his wife saying that she's given birth to a daughter. And the story goes, one of the stories certainly apocryphal, is that he he jumps up for joy and is shot while celebrating. The reality is we think he's probably actually killed dragging a wounded comrade off the battlefield and gets hit by a blast of artillery. But he's commemorated within that church, and I think is symptomatic of actually, or I think at least could be a good representative of something that maybe we haven't focused on so much over the last few episodes, but it's very much important to do so. And that's the fact that, we've talked about really big numbers. 2 million guys at First Marne, 230,000 dead by the end of 1914 for the French. That's 230,000 individual soldiers. And the impact, James, I think, across France as a whole, of these staggering numbers that we see lost in the early part of 15 and the late part of 14, it really shakes France to its core in a way that no other war before in history has ever done.
Yeah. The losses are substantial. I tell any of my friends who might not even be history nerds, if they're on vacation in France, in Paris, in each of the arrondissements or each of the neighborhoods, or in every single small town you drive through, there is a war memorial. I know there's some similar presence of memorials in the UK and some of the Dominion, now Commonwealth countries. Something we don't necessarily have in the United States. We've never suffered anything like this. And during the Great War, France is going to suffer more men killed than the United States will in the entirety of the 20th century in its military conflicts. So every single family of these small towns has a name on these memorials. The loss is it's something that cannot be comprehended, I don't think, by any society today. I was very privileged that at a previous job, I had a boss who was born and raised in France. And when she learned about my interests, she mentioned, oh, yeah, when I was a kid, when you got on the bus, there was always someone who was missing an arm or a leg. And they were just like, oh, yeah, he takes your money. It's just a World War I veteran. It was just so common to see this loss, to see both the families affected, as well as the individuals. There's always many more wounded than killed. And it is something that has scarred France since the armistice. It's something that I struggle as a historian to put into words, as you can hear. But it affects families on all levels. Soldiers themselves are dealing with it in various ways. Some French writing from this time, incredibly dim, very, very deliberate in their descriptions of death. The Fear is a great novel written by a soldier who is fighting in these battles in 1915. It was recently translated into English. It is a novel, but you could tell it's somewhat autobiographical. And I highly encourage readers to pick that up. But to return to these battles, the Second Battle of Artois, 9th May to 18th June, fought on this 20-kilometer front. Just to give an overview sort of this fighting, and I like that you talked and introduced us to the spur of Notre Dame de Lorette and to the French necropolis there, as well as to the cemetery which surrounds it, because one of the other graves you can go and see, and that I like to bring visitors to when I give tours, is the grave of Ernest Jacques Barbeau. Ernest Jacques Barbeau is one of the 42 French generals who's killed in combat during the First World War. Again, not one of these chateau generals that you hear so much about. He's loved by his men. The divisional memorial is a statue of him on the spur, and he's buried in a simple soldier's grave on that spur, leading these assaults. He's killed on the 10th of May while trying to retake Notre Dame de Lorette, something the French army had taken in December, had lost since, and now is going at it again. A famous song that we will discuss in 1917 called the Chanson de Croix, which is banned in France after the war, basically saying, we're up here, we're all going to die, goodbye to life. It's actually written in 1915, and it's originally called the Chanson de Lorette. So you're already starting to see this morale we hit on and being very high of, we've won the First Battle of the Marne, we're going to kick the Germans out of France. That's already starting to waver by May of 1915. Francois Faber, who was killed with the Legion, is among many, many foreigners serving with the French army at these battles. The Moroccan division, which actually seizes the crest of Vimy Ridge on the 9th of May before losing it. They're unsupported. The French haven't figured out yet how to have enough reserves up front to help defend the gains. And that's why when you go and visit Vimy Ridge today, the parking lot, as you walk up to the Canadian Monument, has the memorial to the Moroccan division in it. Among them are soldiers of the Foreign Legion, including Francois Faber And another is a young American named Kiffin Rockwell. And his account of this battle is both sort of illustrious. He's a young blue-blooded man, eventually will join the famous Lafayette Escadrille, the American volunteer pilot serving in the French Air Force. And I love to read this account because it's not translated. This is a blue-blooded North Carolinian talking about his experience in the French Foreign Legion. His description of going into the assault, I think, is particularly interesting. We scrambled out, and from then on, it was nothing but a steady advance under rifle, machine gun, and artillery fire. We certainly had the Boche on the run, but at the same time, they were pouring lead at us. We would dash 25 or 50 meters, and then when the fire got too hot, would drop to the ground with our sacks in front of us, and he's using the French word for knapsack, sack, and lie there until we had our breath. And the bullets were not quite so thick. Then we would take our sacks in one hand as a kind of shield and make another dash. To think of fear or the horror of the thing was impossible. All I can think of was what a wonderful advance it was. Now everyone was going up against that stream of lead as if he loved it. I kept that up for 5 hours. By then we had advanced 3 or 4 kilometers, but were badly cut up and also mixed up with men from other regiments, mostly Algerian tirailleurs. Most of our officers had fallen, including the colonel and 3 commandants, which is the French rank for major. I understand that there now remain only 4 officers out of the whole regiment. We had taken most of the village and were taking the rest of it. My outfit was to the left, and we were being raked by fire from front and from the end of the village still held by the Germans. So these battles, incredibly intense, still some movement going on outside of the trenches. And I can't imagine the image of these legionnaires going forward, holding their packs in front of them as attempted shields as they push up the crest of Vimy Ridge with Notre Dame Lorette looking over them. And this is going to be, again, this is part of that strategy of grignotage, something that we will encounter with the French army as we continue on through 1915.
What a powerful intervention there about the sheer cost of the campaign in 1915. And 1915 in British memory and historiography is focused, of course, so heavily on Gallipoli and the Dardanelles, but the Western Front's bloody for the British and indeed Dominion and Indian forces on the Western Front. About 285,000 casualties are suffered by British and British Empire forces in 1915, dwarfed, of course, by these French casualties, which are of a scale that is unprecedented, really, in war for so little gain. You're fighting against a defender who has all the advantages in 1915, the techniques, the equipment to breach the trench lines, simply not there. But the imperative to do so is absolute within the French army, within the Allied cause as well. In 1915, an awful year for the Allies. The French and the British unable to break in the west. The Russians invaded and hurled back. Gallipoli fails. Serbia is conquered. Bulgaria enters the war. The Italians enter the war with the Allies, but can achieve very little in the Alps. So this is a ghastly period of fighting, a really awful year for the Allied cause and for the French cause especially. And although there's innovations coming, it's not enough at this stage to unseat the Germans, to liberate France. And as 1915 comes to an end, of course, the Allies are going to sit down and plot and plan, well, what can we do better in 1916? But at the same time, the Germans are thinking, how can they do something in the West? Yes, they've won victories in the East, but the real enemies are Britain and France. Defeat them and the war's won. And that's going to lead us into 1916, which for the French army is going to be defined by one word only, and that's Verdun. And that's, of course, what we'll be looking at next week.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
Nice.
Great. Well done. Yeah, nicely done. Nicely done. Thanks.
Good stuff, James. Glad we got you on, because I would just be, the French have got blue uniforms in 1915 and it's great.
I forgot. I draw French fashion designer, but I don't think I mentioned it's Poiret, who is like basically it's like getting Louis Vuitton to design your uniforms
Nice.
today.
Oh, very good.